This is the heartbreaking yet inspiring true story of a billionaire's only son who was given just 7 days left to live by doctors, how his father, with all his fortune and power, could do nothing to change fate, and how an ordinary maid in the household stepped in with simple acts of love and compassion that transformed the boy's final days into a celebration of life, teaching everyone, including the billionaire himself, that money and science alone could not save him, but that the pure power of human kindness and genuine care could create a legacy that would last forever. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video, because when you stop doing this, YouTube understands that you don't like this content and stops recommending good stories like this. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Ethan was only a child, the only son of a wealthy man named Richard, when the doctors gave a news that no family wants to hear. They told Richard that Ethan had only 7 days left to live. Richard, who was a powerful businessman with money, connections, and access to the best medical teams, could not change this reality. He tried everything, called specialists, and ordered the most expensive treatments, but all of them gave the same result. Nothing could be done. Inside the big mansion where they lived, the atmosphere turned heavy. The wide halls that once felt alive became filled with silence and sorrow. The father sat in his office many hours, unable to find comfort, while Ethan cried in his room. Richard had always been the man in control, the one who could fix any problem, but now he was powerless. This made the sadness even harder to bear. The people who worked in the house tried to go on with their tasks, but everyone felt the weight of the situation. It was during one of these quiet moments that Maria, the maid who had worked there for many years, heard Ethan's sobs coming from upstairs. Maria was a simple woman who came from a poor background. She had been cleaning, cooking, and taking care of small duties in the mansion for a long time, and though she was never part of the family, she had always cared for Ethan from a distance. Hearing his cry that night struck her deeply. She put down the laundry basket she was carrying and walked slowly toward his room. She found him curled up on the bed, his face wet with tears. His small body looked fragile, almost breakable, and in that moment, Maria felt something stir inside her heart. She knew she could not heal him, and she could not fight the illness, but she could do something else. She could give meaning to the time he still had. Instead of letting him spend his last days in despair, she could help him find moments of joy. Maria sat beside him, touched his hand softly, and told him that he was not alone. Ethan looked up, surprised by her presence, and for the first time that day, his tears slowed down. From that point on, Maria made a decision. She would not allow Ethan's final days to be defined only by sadness. She had no riches, no doctors, and no authority, but she had determination and kindness. She thought about what could matter to a child in such a situation. It wasn't gifts or expensive things. It was care, attention, and simple experiences that gave life meaning. She decided to take each day as a new chance to bring him comfort, hope, and even laughter. She told herself that she would create small memories that could make the boy feel loved, even if for a short time. That night, she planned quietly, while everyone else in the house struggled with grief. Maria was not a person of big words. She was not educated, but she carried a strength that came from surviving a difficult life. She compared Ethan in her mind to a newborn foal that had fallen and could not stand, and she knew she could not leave him lying there without trying. She would lift him with whatever strength she had left in her own body and spirit. The following morning, Maria began her mission. She entered Ethan's room with a tray of breakfast, not something fancy, but something made with care. She had cut the bread in little shapes, placed a bit of honey on the plate, and added a glass of warm milk. When Ethan saw it, his eyes showed a faint sparkle, as if he understood this was prepared for him personally. Maria sat down and ate with him, talking about small things. She asked him about his favorite animals, his favorite stories, and his dreams. Ethan answered shyly at first, but soon he was smiling a little, remembering times when he played in the garden or when Richard had taken him to the zoo. After breakfast, Maria brought him outside to the garden, holding his hand as they walked slowly under the morning light. She showed him the flowers, the butterflies, and encouraged him to touch the leaves and feel the world around him. For a short time, Ethan forgot his pain. That small morning was the first step of the journey Maria had chosen to create, a path where love and courage would replace fear and sorrow. Each day became part of a plan that Maria kept shaping. She thought carefully about what could make Ethan's limited time special. She organized simple games with things she found in the house, like card houses, drawing with pencils, or making little paper boats to float in a bowl of water. These were not expensive toys, but they brought real smiles to Ethan's face. She also told him stories, not from books, but from her own imagination. She created characters that faced challenges but never gave up, heroes that reminded Ethan of himself. She let him decide how the stories would end, and often he would choose endings filled with courage and hope. Maria noticed that Ethan began to wait for her visits, to look forward to their time together. The mansion, once heavy with silence, started to echo with small bursts of laughter and gentle conversations. Even Richard noticed the change, though he remained distant, still lost in his own grief. Maria, however, continued with her promise, pushing forward day after day, giving meaning to each hour that passed. As the days went on, Ethan grew weaker, but he also grew calmer. He no longer cried as he had before, because he felt supported and cared for. Maria stayed close, sometimes just sitting beside him in silence, sometimes holding his hand until he fell asleep. The other workers in the mansion began to notice too. They saw how the maid, the woman who had no status, was giving the boy something that wealth could not buy. Richard himself started to see that Maria was doing what he could not do, bringing comfort to his son in a way that was real. Though he did not say much, his respect for her grew quietly. On the 7th day, the sadness of the inevitable still hovered over the mansion, but Ethan faced it differently than he would have at the beginning. He had lived those last days with love and courage, not with fear and emptiness. And it had all started that night, when Maria heard the child crying and made the choice not to turn away, but to give his final days a meaning that neither money nor power could provide. Maria began to dedicate every single moment of her day to Ethan. She no longer treated him just as the boy who lived in the large mansion, but as a child who needed comfort, attention, and companionship. Each morning she thought of small surprises that could lift his mood. Sometimes she folded pieces of paper into shapes and animals. Other times she brought kitchen spoons and turned them into funny puppets, making voices and little stories that made Ethan laugh. She also remembered old songs from her childhood, tunes that she had learned from her mother, and she sang them in a simple, gentle way. Ethan would listen closely, sometimes clapping his weak hands along with the rhythm. The boy, who had been lying in bed without energy, began to react, his eyes opening wider, his voice trying to join her melodies. His days, once marked by silence and sadness, slowly filled with the sound of laughter, questions, and stories. Richard, his father, started to notice the difference too. From his office, he could sometimes hear Ethan's small bursts of joy, and it was something he thought he would never hear again. It surprised him deeply, leaving him both grateful and confused. Ethan, who had been apathetic and distant after hearing the cruel diagnosis, began to show signs of life again. He smiled more often, his body relaxed, and he asked Maria to stay longer in his room. She taught him little games like guessing objects while blindfolded or telling riddles. Even though his strength was fading, his curiosity grew stronger. He wanted to hear more about Maria's own life, her childhood in a poor neighborhood, and the things she had dreamed about when she was his age. Maria, at first shy, told him about how she used to play in the street with improvised toys, about her brothers, and about how she always wished to study but had to work early instead. Ethan listened with wide eyes, imagining a world so different from his own. The mansion felt less like a prison for him and more like a place filled with new discoveries because Maria made it so. Richard sometimes stood at the door, watching silently. Seeing his son laugh again almost felt like witnessing a miracle. Every new day brought with it a small moment of hope. Maria realized that Ethan needed more than distraction. He needed to feel alive, even if only for short bursts of time. She started making dolls from old cloth, tying them together with string and creating characters for stories they could play together. She gave them names and voices, and Ethan helped her invent adventures for them. These simple dolls became his favorite companions. Alongside that, Maria sang lullabies she remembered from when she was a girl, songs that were meant to calm children before bed. Ethan found peace in those melodies, often falling asleep with a smile on his face, holding one of the cloth dolls in his hand. Richard, who had spent so many years believing money solved everything, was confronted with a truth he had ignored. Care and kindness could achieve what medicine and wealth could not. He sat alone at night thinking about what he had witnessed, wondering how a humble maid could change his son's final days so completely. For Richard, it was something almost unbelievable. The boy's transformation was not about his body growing stronger, but about his spirit coming back to life. His eyes, once dull and tired, now carried a brightness that made everyone around him feel different. The staff in the mansion noticed it as well, whispering to each other about how Ethan no longer seemed like the same child. Maria stayed by his side, telling endless stories and listening carefully whenever he spoke. Ethan told her things he never told his father, fears he had, and also little dreams, like wanting to see the ocean or to ride a bicycle without help. Maria listened to everything, never dismissing his words, always encouraging him to keep imagining. She made him believe that every day was worth living, even if there were only a few left. Ethan's world, which had shrunk to the size of a bed and a room, expanded again in his mind through the care Maria gave him. This was not medicine, but it was something that reached deeper than medicine ever could. Richard, standing in the shadows, struggled to accept how much hope had grown inside his son. Richard began to see something that felt impossible to him. His son, who had no more strength according to doctors, seemed to have been reborn in spirit. The sparkle in Ethan's eyes reminded Richard of when he was much younger, before illness took over. He felt torn between sadness and admiration. On one hand, he knew the medical truth had not changed. On the other hand, he could not deny what he was seeing. Maria had become more than just an employee. She was the one who gave his son a reason to smile again. Richard found himself walking past Ethan's door more often, staying longer just to observe. He never spoke much, but his face showed emotions he was not used to displaying. He watched Maria patiently teaching Ethan how to fold paper animals, watched her clap her hands to a song, watched her laugh softly when Ethan made a joke. Richard's heart, heavy with grief, felt lighter in those moments. The house itself seemed less dark, filled with a fragile light born from the bond between the maid and his son. For the first time in weeks, Richard thought there might still be meaning in these days. For Ethan, each moment turned into something magical. The hours no longer felt like a countdown to the end, but like small pieces of life to be lived fully. He stopped asking how many days were left and instead asked what surprise Maria had planned for tomorrow. She never disappointed him. Sometimes it was a game, sometimes a story, and sometimes just her presence and a warm smile. That was enough for him. Maria did not need special tools, medicines, or complicated plans. All she needed was her time, her patience, and her genuine care. With that, she gave Ethan a new kind of strength, not physical but emotional. For him, this strength was everything. Richard finally admitted to himself that what Maria was doing was extraordinary. He realized he had been blind to the value of simple kindness. While the doctors had measured Ethan's life in numbers and days, Maria had filled those same days with joy and purpose. It was like hope had been born again, not from science or wealth, but from love and presence. And it had all started with Maria deciding to give her heart to a boy who needed it. Maria knew that time was slipping away, and she could not waste a single day. After giving Ethan comfort inside the mansion, she decided to take him outside for the first time in weeks. She guided him slowly into the garden, supporting his small body with gentle care. The garden was large, filled with paths, flowers, and trimmed bushes, but for Ethan it felt like entering a new world. He had been locked away in his room for so long that even the fresh air felt different. Maria pointed to the roses and daisies that grew in clusters, letting Ethan touch the petals with his hands. She showed him a caterpillar crawling on a leaf and explained how it would one day turn into a butterfly. When a real butterfly flew past them, Ethan's face lit up in amazement, and he tried to follow it with his eyes until it disappeared among the trees. Later, as the sun began to set, Maria asked him to sit beside her on a wooden bench. Together, they watched the sky change colors, turning orange and red. For Ethan, these simple gestures felt extraordinary, like small miracles happening right before him, filling his heart with a quiet happiness. Each visit to the garden became part of their routine. Maria wanted Ethan to experience the beauty of the outside world, even in simple ways. Sometimes she showed him how to plant a seed, digging a small hole with her hands and letting him drop it inside before covering it again with soil. She explained how, with time, the seed would grow into a plant. Ethan listened carefully, fascinated by the idea of something so small becoming something alive and tall. Other times they collected fallen leaves of different shapes, creating little piles and comparing their colors. Ethan asked questions, wanting to know why some leaves were green and others brown. Maria answered as best as she could, but what mattered most was that Ethan was curious again. He laughed when a bird hopped close to him and tilted its head, as if listening. These tiny experiences gave Ethan a sense of wonder that medicine had not brought. Each step in the garden built a bond between the maid and the boy, making their connection stronger with every shared discovery. Richard, who spent much of his time in his office or on business calls, started to notice the changes in his son more clearly. From the balcony, he could see Maria leading Ethan along the garden paths, holding his hand as if protecting him from falling. At first, Richard did not understand why these little moments mattered so much. He was a man used to solving problems with contracts, money, and decisions made in boardrooms. Yet, what Maria was giving to Ethan had nothing to do with wealth or power. Richard watched as his son's eyes shone with excitement when he picked a flower or followed a butterfly. It was something that no amount of money had been able to provide. He felt confused and even a bit helpless, realizing that a humble maid was succeeding where he had failed. For Richard, the sight was both humbling and painful. He began to ask himself questions he had never thought about before. Why had he not taken the time to do these things with his son? And why had he believed that money could replace simple love and presence? The doctors who came to check on Ethan were surprised as well. When they had given their initial reports, they expected to find him weaker each day, losing interest in life. Instead, they were met with a boy who, though still ill, showed more energy than they thought possible. Ethan smiled when they entered the room, told them stories about what he had seen in the garden, and even asked questions about how plants grew or how butterflies lived. One doctor whispered to another that it was unusual to see a child in such condition with so much spirit left. The change in Ethan was not physical healing, but a mental and emotional strength that gave him an entirely different appearance. Maria stayed quiet during these visits, letting the doctors speak, but inside she felt proud. She had no degrees, no medical background, yet she was the one helping the boy find the will to face each day. To her, this was proof that kindness and presence could reach deeper than medicine alone. The doctors left each time puzzled, but also impressed. Ethan himself began to change in how he viewed his days. Before, the thought of his sickness and the countdown to the end filled him with fear. Now, he thought more about what Maria would show him next. He asked if tomorrow they could see the fish in the pond, or if they could collect flowers of every color to make a little bouquet. His imagination stretched further, sometimes asking if they could build a small house for the birds, or make a swing in the tree. Even though Maria knew some of these things were not possible, she never crushed his ideas. Instead, she encouraged him to dream, promising they would do as much as they could together. Ethan started to smile more, his eyes shining with curiosity rather than despair. The mansion staff, who once avoided talking about the boy's future, noticed this change too. They whispered among themselves about how Maria had transformed Ethan's last days into something meaningful. For Ethan, each moment with Maria was a lesson in life, not just a way of saying goodbye. Day after day, the bond between Maria and Ethan grew deeper. It was no longer just a maid looking after a sick child. It became a relationship built on trust, affection, and shared experiences. Richard, standing apart, slowly realized that what Maria had created was beyond his understanding, but undeniable. Ethan seemed more alive than he had been since the diagnosis, and all because someone chose to be present in the simplest, most human way. To Ethan, the garden was no longer just a piece of land. It became a place of wonder, full of miracles in small forms. To Richard, it was a lesson he struggled to accept. Money could not buy the peace he saw in his son's eyes. The doctors continued to express their surprise at Ethan's unexpected energy, and Maria quietly continued her mission. She had turned what should have been a painful farewell into a journey of discovery and love. In this way, Maria transformed the meaning of goodbye into a powerful new understanding of life itself. In just a few days, Ethan seemed to be a completely different child. Before, he had spent most of his time lying in bed, pale and weak, barely reacting to the world around him. Now he was moving more, laughing at simple jokes, and even asking Maria to invent new games. His fragile voice, which had once been soft and broken, now echoed through the mansion with energy that surprised everyone. The staff heard him from the hallways, sometimes laughing loudly, sometimes calling Maria's name to show her something he had just done. His skin, which had been almost colorless, slowly gained back a natural tone. His cheeks carried a faint redness that had not been seen in weeks. Ethan even began to talk about things he wanted to do, things that had once felt impossible for him. He spoke about climbing trees, riding a horse, and running across the fields, things he had only seen other children do. Maria listened with patience, never telling him that these dreams were out of reach. Instead, she encouraged him, telling him to keep imagining, to keep believing. For Ethan, her words were powerful, making him feel stronger, as if his sickness had less control over his life. Maria continued to guide Ethan with the same devotion she had shown since the beginning. She never let him feel like a sick boy who needed pity. Instead, she treated him as a child capable of more than he believed. She encouraged him to take small steps in the garden, holding his hand at first, then letting him try on his own. Each time he succeeded, Ethan smiled proudly, showing a courage that amazed her. She invented challenges for him, such as stacking blocks, solving riddles, or drawing shapes, and praised him every time he tried. Maria told him stories about children who overcame difficult things, reminding him that strength was not only in the body, but also in the heart. Ethan listened closely, absorbing her words as if they were truth. His confidence grew quickly, and he acted like he had aged years in only a few days. The boy who had once been silent and resigned now showed courage rarely seen even in adults. He began to believe he was more than his illness. Maria knew his time was short, but she also knew she was giving him a gift far greater than days. She was giving him hope, bravery, and self-belief. Richard, at first, kept his distance. He had been overwhelmed by the pain of knowing his son's fate, and he preferred to hide behind his work and his grief. But the sounds coming from Ethan's room and from the garden drew his attention. He started to follow them quietly, standing at doorways or watching from windows. What he saw shocked him every time. Ethan, who had once been nearly lifeless, now played with cloth dolls, laughed while chasing butterflies, and even sang along with Maria. Richard could not understand how such a transformation had happened in so little time. He realized that it had nothing to do with doctors, medicine, or money. It came from the care and love Maria gave freely. Watching them together, he began to see that his son was not just surviving his final days, but truly living them. Richard, a man used to controlling everything, realized he had no control here. It humbled him, showing him that sometimes the simplest things carried the most power. He started to respect Maria in silence, knowing that she was giving his son something that he himself had never been able to give. Every day, Richard found himself watching a little longer. He walked through the hallways quietly, standing in the shadows while Maria and Ethan played. Sometimes Ethan's laughter was so strong that Richard felt tears welling in his own eyes. He realized how much he had missed these sounds in the house, sounds that no business deal or fortune could ever replace. Richard also noticed Ethan's bravery. The boy was no longer afraid of his weakness. He faced small challenges with determination, encouraged by Maria's words. It was like he had grown older overnight, learning lessons about courage and strength in just a few days. Richard wondered how this could be possible, how a child so close to the end could live with such energy and happiness. The answer became clearer each time he watched them. Maria was not only keeping Ethan company, she was teaching him how to face life, even at its hardest moment. She was filling his last days with dignity and meaning, giving him the freedom to be a child again. This realization struck Richard deeply, changing the way he looked at both his son and Maria. Maria noticed Richard's presence more often but never said anything. She focused on Ethan, making sure he felt supported in everything he tried. She read him stories about heroes who faced great dangers, comparing their strength to his own. Ethan listened carefully, often repeating her words as if they were his personal motto. She reminded him that bravery was not about winning, but about trying without fear. Ethan believed her, and each time he succeeded in something small, like walking across the garden or building a tower with blocks, he celebrated as if it were a victory. The bond between them grew stronger, and Ethan trusted her completely. Maria knew the doctor's prediction still hung over them, but she refused to let fear dominate the boy's mind. Instead, she gave him confidence and love, allowing him to feel free. The boy's laughter filled the house so much that even the other workers felt lighter. They whispered among themselves that Maria was performing a miracle. For Ethan, however, it was simple. She was showing him how to live, not how to wait for the end. That was all he needed, to feel like the happiest child alive. Richard finally understood the truth as he continued to watch. Maria was not just caring for Ethan's fragile body, she was giving him something immeasurable, love in its purest form. That love gave Ethan strength that medicine could not explain. Richard, a man who had always believed in logic and control, realized that the most powerful force in his son's transformation was something he had never valued enough. He felt ashamed, but also grateful, knowing that without Maria, Ethan's final days would have been filled with despair instead of joy. Standing by the window, watching his son smile and laugh, Richard accepted that money and doctors had failed, but Maria had succeeded. Her devotion had not only changed Ethan, but had also changed him. For the first time, he admitted to himself that he had much to learn from this simple woman. He had built empires and handled millions, but he had never given his son what Maria gave with ease: pure love. In that moment, Richard saw clearly that Ethan's courage and happiness were born from her presence, and he knew that this was the greatest gift his son could ever receive. One night, Ethan woke up weaker than usual, his small body trembling and his eyes filled with fear. The darkness of the room made him feel even more vulnerable, and he clung to his blanket as if it could protect him. He whispered to Maria, who had been dozing in a chair nearby, that he was afraid of dying. His voice was soft and shaky, but the words were clear: and they broke her heart. Maria quickly stood up and went to his side, taking his fragile hand into her own. She could feel how cold his fingers were, and she held them firmly, as if to remind him that he was not alone. She told him to breathe slowly and promised she would not leave his side. Ethan stared at her with wide, tearful eyes, waiting for an answer that could make the fear go away. Maria, searching for the right words, began to tell him stories. She spoke of brave heroes who fought monsters in battles that seemed impossible, yet they always found the strength to win. She explained that courage was not about being strong in the body, but strong in the heart, and she told him he was also a warrior. Ethan listened carefully to Maria's words, his breathing still uneven but calmer with each sentence she spoke. He asked her if the heroes were ever afraid, and Maria nodded, saying they all were, but what made them different was that they did not let fear stop them. This idea seemed to strike something deep in him. Slowly, he wiped his tears with the back of his hand and told Maria he wanted to be like those heroes. He did not want to waste the little time he had left being afraid. Instead, he wanted to live each moment with courage. Maria smiled softly, brushing the hair from his forehead, and told him she believed in him completely. His face, once pale and terrified, began to change as determination replaced fear. His eyes, though tired, started to shine in a way that felt almost unreal, as if there was a light coming from inside him. The glow in his gaze filled the room with a sense of hope, and even Maria felt stronger simply by looking at him. It was as if Ethan had made a choice in that moment to fight with his spirit, no matter what would come. That night, Ethan's transformation became clear. He sat up a little straighter, holding Maria's hand tightly, and declared that he would not spend his last days in fear. Instead, he would spend them as a warrior, someone who lived bravely until the very end. Maria hugged him gently, telling him she had always known he had the heart of a fighter. The boy closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, and the sparkle was still there, steady and bright. It gave Maria chills to see such strength in someone so small and frail. She continued telling him stories of heroes until he drifted back into sleep, but this time he was no longer trembling. His breathing was even, and there was a calm expression on his face. Maria remained by his side, watching him, and silently thanking whatever force had given Ethan that sudden burst of courage. For her, that night was proof that love and belief could turn fear into strength. She felt proud to witness it, knowing this was a turning point not just for Ethan, but for everyone in the house who loved him. What Maria did not know was that Richard had been standing quietly outside the room. He had heard Ethan's frightened voice, and his first instinct was to step inside, but something stopped him at the door. He remained hidden in the shadows, listening as Maria comforted his son with her stories of heroes. As he listened, he began to cry silently. The sight of his son, once broken by fear, but now filled with courage, was too much for him to handle. He covered his mouth with his hand to stifle the sobs, tears rolling down his face freely. For years, Richard had believed he was strong because of his power, money, and control. But in that moment, he realized that true strength came from something far simpler. It came from love, faith, and the courage to face the impossible. Richard understood then that Maria had given Ethan a gift greater than anything he could ever buy. It was not medicine or wealth that had transformed his son's heart, but the simple presence of someone who believed in him when he felt the weakest. From that night onward, everything in the mansion changed. The fear of death no longer dominated conversations. Ethan himself no longer asked questions about when his time would come. Instead, he spoke of living courageously, of making every day count. He even asked Maria if he could leave behind something that would remind others of him, something that showed he had not been afraid. Maria encouraged him, telling him that every smile, every story, and every act of courage was already a legacy. She reminded him that people would remember the strength he showed in the hardest moment of his life. Ethan seemed proud of this idea, and it gave him even more determination. Richard, though still struggling with grief, started to see his son not as a fragile boy who was slipping away, but as someone who had become a true example of bravery. The atmosphere in the mansion, once heavy and hopeless, began to feel different. It was still filled with sadness, but now it carried something else as well. Faith, the kind that replaces fear and gives life meaning, even in the face of death. Ethan had found a new identity for himself. He was no longer just a sick boy waiting for the end, but a warrior who faced the unimaginable with courage. Maria continued to nurture his spirit with stories, songs, and unwavering support. And Ethan lived each day as if it mattered. His eyes, which once reflected despair, now shined with hope that felt almost supernatural. Richard could not forget the moment he had witnessed that glow in his son's face. It haunted him, but in a good way, teaching him lessons he had never expected to learn. He realized that his son's illness no longer defined him. What defined Ethan now was his courage and the love that surrounded him. From that night forward, there was no more talk of sickness in the house. Instead, there was talk of legacy, of how Ethan's bravery would be remembered forever. Fear had been replaced by faith in the hearts of everyone who loved him. Like a hero in his own story, Ethan had discovered a strength that allowed him to face the unimaginable with dignity and hope. The sixth day began with Ethan feeling weaker than usual, but he still asked Maria to take him to the garden. She helped him walk slowly, holding his hand firmly as they stepped onto the grass. Richard watched from a distance, his heart heavy but unwilling to stop them. For a moment, everything seemed calm. Ethan smiled faintly when he saw the flowers and pointed at a butterfly that landed nearby. Then, without warning, his small body gave in and he collapsed to the ground. Maria gasped, calling his name, while Richard rushed forward in panic. He lifted his son's fragile body into his arms, shouting desperately for help. The staff ran toward them, and one of the servants called the doctors immediately. Ethan's face was pale, his eyes closed, and his breathing faint. Richard, who was used to controlling every situation, felt powerless, holding his son and begging him to wake up. When the doctors arrived, they examined him quickly, but their faces gave away the truth. They had no solution left, no treatment, no miracle to offer. The silence from the men in white coats felt like a death sentence, and Richard's world seemed to collapse around him in that instant. Maria did not accept that silence. She pushed closer, kneeling beside Ethan as Richard still held him. She took one of his small hands in hers and began to whisper softly into his ear. Her voice was calm but steady, speaking words filled with warmth. She reminded him of the games they had played, the songs they had sung, and the laughter they had shared in the garden. She told him about the dolls they had made from cloth, the butterflies they had chased, and the stories of heroes he loved so much. Maria wanted his mind to hold onto those happy moments instead of fear. She spoke to him like a mother would to her child, repeating again and again that he was not alone, that he had always been brave, and that she believed in him. Richard, holding his son close, listened to Maria's words and felt their power. While the doctors stood aside helplessly, Maria gave Ethan something far stronger than medicine: comfort, faith, and love. The air felt heavy, yet her voice cut through, giving life to a boy who seemed to be slipping away. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan's fingers twitched in Maria's hand, and his eyelids slowly began to move. Richard leaned closer, hardly daring to hope. After a long pause, Ethan opened his eyes weakly and looked at both of them. His lips curved into a small smile, fragile but real. With a soft voice, almost a whisper, he told them that he was not afraid. The words were simple, but they carried a weight stronger than anything else in that moment. Maria held back her tears, smiling back at him with pride. Richard, who had spent days drowning in despair, felt tears roll down his face as he heard his son's courage. Ethan had not gained strength from medicine or from doctors, but from the love and presence surrounding him. He had chosen to face the darkness, not with fear, but with dignity. His smile, though faint, filled the garden with an energy that no one could explain. Everyone present was struck silent, knowing they had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that could not be measured by science. Richard felt his world shift in those moments. For the first time in his life, he realized that not everything could be bought, solved, or controlled. He had spent his life believing money and influence could conquer any challenge, but now he understood that true strength came from love and faith. Watching his son smile through the pain broke something inside him, but it also built something new. He saw Ethan as more than a sick child. He saw him as a warrior who had chosen courage over fear. Richard felt ashamed that he had not been able to give his son this gift, yet he also felt thankful to Maria, who had carried Ethan through his darkest moments with her kindness. He wiped his tears, holding his son tighter, and whispered words of love he had never dared to say before. Ethan's calm expression gave Richard strength too, teaching him in silence what no lesson in business or life had ever done. It was not about avoiding the end, but facing it with dignity and courage. Maria continued to stay close, still holding Ethan's hand as if anchoring him to the present. She whispered to him again, not about fear, but about victories. She told him he had already won by smiling, by living every day to the fullest, despite the sickness. She compared him to the heroes in the stories they loved, the ones who faced monsters without running away. Ethan, his eyes half closed, nodded slightly, as if he understood every word. Maria's presence was steady, her voice never breaking, giving Ethan the peace he needed. Around them, the mansion staff stood quietly, some with tears in their eyes. They all knew they were witnessing something unforgettable. Richard, though torn apart by emotions, began to see his son not as dying, but as teaching him one final lesson, that love was stronger than despair. That night, no one in the house spoke of medicine or treatments anymore. They spoke of courage, of the boy who had chosen to face the impossible without fear, guided by a woman who gave her whole heart. What happened in the garden that day stayed in everyone's memory as more than a tragedy. Richard finally saw clearly that it was not an ending, but a spiritual victory. His son had shown courage in its purest form, and Maria had been the one to nurture it. It was not doctors or wealth that had kept Ethan alive in that moment, but the bond of love that surrounded him. Richard thought of the stories Maria had told about heroes, and he realized Ethan had become one himself. Just like the tale of the horse that had faced a bear without backing down, Ethan was facing death with the same dignity and strength. The boy's fragile body could not be saved, but his spirit was unbroken, shining brighter than ever before. For Richard, this truth was painful, but also powerful. He understood now that Ethan's legacy would not be measured in years, but in the courage he showed. And in that moment, Richard finally accepted that what he had witnessed was not defeat, but the greatest victory his son could have achieved. On the last day, the family was called to gather in the mansion. Everyone knew this moment was coming, but it still felt unreal when it arrived. Richard, his heart heavy and eyes tired from sleepless nights, stayed close to Ethan's room as the boy woke up weaker than ever. Maria, however, did not let the sadness dominate the atmosphere. She had prepared something special for Ethan, something that would make his final hours full of joy instead of sorrow. With the help of the other servants, she decorated the garden with colorful balloons tied to the branches of trees and chairs. She arranged a small table with simple food, sweets, and juice. Music played softly in the background, not loud, but enough to bring a cheerful tone to the moment. She wanted Ethan to have one last celebration, a goodbye surrounded by smiles rather than tears. When Ethan saw the garden, his face lit up and his weak body seemed to gain a little more energy. His eyes widened in amazement, and he asked if it was all for him. Maria knelt beside him, squeezed his hand, and told him it was his party, a farewell filled with love and happiness. Despite his fragility, Ethan insisted on being part of everything. With Maria and Richard supporting him, he walked slowly into the garden, his small steps cheered on by the servants who clapped lightly. The boy smiled, his face glowing with a happiness that had been rare in recent weeks. He sat down on a chair decorated with balloons and looked around, soaking in every detail. He pointed at the colorful strings, the plates of food, and the laughter of those around him. The atmosphere, though bittersweet, felt like a true celebration of his life. Richard sat close, unsure at first, but Ethan pulled at his hand and asked him to stay. That simple gesture broke down the last barrier in Richard's heart. For hours, the father and son played small games, tossed a ball gently back and forth, and even shared jokes that made Ethan laugh until he coughed lightly. Richard had never seen his son so alive and so brave. For him, it was a day of rediscovery, where he realized too late how much love he had missed giving, but also how grateful he was for this last chance. Maria never left Ethan's side. She watched him carefully, making sure he had enough rest while still enjoying each moment. She cut small pieces of cake and fed him slowly, smiling every time he finished one. The other servants also took turns playing with him. They made funny faces, told jokes, and even danced to the soft music, making Ethan laugh again and again. His laughter filled the garden, and for a moment it was easy to forget the shadow of what was to come. Ethan thanked everyone with his small voice, saying how happy he was to have all of them around. Maria felt her chest tighten with emotion, but she did not cry. She wanted him to see only joy and peace in her face. She squeezed his hand tightly, whispering little words of encouragement whenever he grew tired. Each detail of the celebration mattered to him, the balloons moving gently, the taste of the sweets, the warmth of his father's presence, and the love shining from Maria's eyes. He cherished every second, as if he knew how precious they were. As the day passed, Ethan grew visibly weaker, but he never stopped smiling. He leaned against Richard's chest while holding Maria's hand firmly, not wanting to let go. The sun slowly descended in the sky, and the colors of the evening filled the garden. Ethan watched the sunset with wide eyes, as if memorizing it. Richard stroked his hair gently, whispering how proud he was of him, while Maria softly hummed one of the songs that had always calmed him. The servants stayed close, silent now, witnessing the moment with respect. For Ethan, it was the perfect ending, surrounded by everyone who loved him, in the garden that had become his place of discovery and joy. Even as his breaths grew slower, he continued to squeeze Maria's hand lightly, showing he was still present. The peace in his face amazed everyone around him. There was no fear, no tears, only the calm of a child who had chosen courage. Richard felt tears streaming uncontrollably, but he held his son close, grateful for every second they had shared on this final day together. When Ethan finally closed his eyes for the last time, the garden remained silent. His head rested peacefully, his expression calm, as if he had simply fallen into a gentle sleep. Maria, still holding his hand, whispered softly that he was safe now, that he had been the bravest boy she had ever known. Richard could not stop crying, but in his heart, he felt something different than despair. He realized that his son had left not with pain, but with dignity and joy. The servants lowered their heads, some wiping their tears, but all of them felt proud to have shared this farewell. It was not the image of sickness that they would remember, but the image of a child laughing, playing, and celebrating life until the very end. Maria kissed his forehead gently, her tears finally falling, but her heart filled with gratitude for having given him the farewell he deserved. She knew that Ethan's final memory was not of fear, but of love. Ethan's passing that evening was not marked by sorrow alone, but by something greater. He had faced the unimaginable with courage, leaving behind more than just memories. For Richard, it was a lesson that wealth and power could never teach, that true legacy comes from love and humanity. For Maria, it was the confirmation that she had fulfilled her promise, giving meaning to every single day of Ethan's short life. For the servants, it was an unforgettable moment, proof that joy could exist even in the hardest circumstances. Ethan had left the world wrapped in peace, surrounded by those who cared for him, leaving behind an example far stronger than his illness. Like a hero who saved his herd in the face of danger, Ethan had saved the hearts of those who loved him from despair. He left behind not silence, but a lasting memory of courage, joy, and kindness. His short life became a story that would never be forgotten, carried forever by those who were there to witness his final day of bravery and love. The story of Ethan and Maria did not stay inside the walls of the mansion. The servants, who had been present during those unforgettable days, had recorded several short videos of the boy smiling, playing, and laughing with Maria. At first, they shared them only among themselves, as a way to keep the memory of those moments alive. But soon, one of them posted a clip on social media, and it spread quickly. People were touched by the sight of a fragile child who had so little time left, enjoying life with such genuine happiness. In one video, Ethan was holding Maria's hand while looking at butterflies in the garden. In another, he laughed as she made puppets out of spoons. The images were simple, but they carried something powerful that words alone could not explain. Within days, the videos had reached thousands of views, and soon after, millions. The story of the boy who lived his final days with courage and the maid who gave him love beyond measure was now known across the country. Newspapers, television programs, and online platforms began talking about Ethan, but especially about Maria, the woman who gave him back his joy when everyone else thought it was impossible. The media quickly gave Maria a title that captured people's emotions: the mother he never had in his heart. Though Richard had always been Ethan's father, and though Ethan's biological mother had not been part of his life, it was Maria who stepped into a role that went beyond her job. Journalists highlighted how her simple gestures transformed the boy's last days into a celebration of life. They replayed the videos on television, describing how she turned spoons into toys, sang childhood songs, and told stories that gave Ethan strength to face death with courage. Commentators on talk shows discussed her actions, some saying that she represented the best side of humanity. Others said her devotion was proof that love does not come from blood, but from choice and heart. Richard watched these broadcasts silently, often overwhelmed by emotion. He had always been a man who valued privacy and avoided media attention, but this time he could not deny that Maria's story was bigger than their home. Her love had created something impossible to hide, a legacy that belonged to everyone who watched and felt moved. While Maria became a symbol of kindness in the media, scientists and doctors were also asked for their opinions. They explained that Ethan's case was unusual because most children in his condition spent their last days in constant pain and sadness. They admitted that there was no scientific explanation for how he managed to show such energy and joy in his final week. Some spoke about the psychological impact of positive emotions on the body, while others said it was rare, but not impossible. But the truth, they all agreed, was that Maria's presence had changed Ethan's experience completely. The focus was no longer on his illness, but on how he had lived with dignity, love, and courage. Scientists called it a rare case of emotional transformation, but for the public, it was something far greater. People watching the story did not see numbers, charts, or medical terms. They saw proof that true compassion can break barriers and change lives in ways that medicine alone cannot. The discussion spread beyond hospitals and universities, reaching schools, workplaces, and homes, where families talked about Ethan's example. Everyone agreed on one point: Maria had shown the world the power of simple, selfless love. As the videos continued to spread, ordinary people began to take inspiration from the story. Social networks were filled with messages from strangers thanking Maria for her example. Parents said they hugged their children tighter after watching the clips. Teachers shared Ethan's story with their students, using it to explain what kindness and empathy mean. Even hospitals reported that families of sick children felt encouraged after learning about Maria and Ethan, believing that love and care could bring light into the darkest moments. The impact went far beyond the mansion, turning into a movement that encouraged compassion and human connection. Maria herself remained humble, avoiding interviews whenever she could. She never saw herself as a heroine, only as someone who did what needed to be done for a child who deserved happiness. But to everyone else, she became a symbol of hope. Crowds praised her, saying she reminded the world that love does not need to be grand or expensive. It only needs to be real. Through her, people began to believe again that humanity could be rescued from coldness and indifference, one act of compassion at a time. Richard, however, experienced the story from a different angle. For him, the coverage was a mirror that forced him to reflect on his past choices. He had been known as a businessman who dominated markets, sealed powerful deals, and increased his fortune endlessly. But as he watched his son's story spread across the nation, he realized that none of his wealth could match what Maria had given Ethan. He thought about the countless hours he had spent chasing success, while Maria, a woman of simple life and no wealth, had achieved something greater than all his achievements combined. She had given his son peace, happiness, and the courage to face the end. Richard finally admitted to himself that he had been blind for too long. He began to understand that the true treasure of life was not money, but humanity itself, the ability to care for others with sincerity. Maria had reminded him of something he had lost along the way, something no business empire could replace. For the first time, Richard felt free of pride, and he saw his fortune as meaningless compared to the lesson unfolding before his eyes. The story of Ethan and Maria continued to inspire people long after his passing. In schools, children remembered the boy who smiled until the end. In hospitals, families repeated Maria's words about courage and hope. In homes, parents and children hugged each other, grateful for life. The media called it a national lesson, but to those who knew the truth, it was something even deeper. Ethan had left behind a legacy not measured in years, but in the impact of his final days. Maria, the maid who had once been invisible, became the heart of that legacy. Richard, the powerful man who thought he owned the world, discovered that true greatness came from humility and compassion. The entire country agreed that Ethan's short life revealed something eternal, that genuine love has the power to transform fear into peace, weakness into courage, and sadness into joy. Like a light shining beyond the mansion walls, their story spread everywhere, reminding people of what truly matters. For Richard, the greatest wealth he had ever known was not his fortune, but the humanity rescued by the silent kindness of his faithful servant. Richard was soon called to face questions he had never imagined he would answer. Journalists crowded around him at press conferences, in front of his office, and even outside the mansion gates. The public wanted to know why it was not him, with all his wealth and influence, who had managed to give Ethan happiness in his last days. Instead, it was Maria, a simple maid, who had filled the boy's heart with joy. Social media amplified the debate, turning it into what some called a social trial, where people judged Richard's role as a father. Television programs analyzed the videos of Maria and Ethan, comparing her tenderness with Richard's absence. People asked if money had blinded him, if business had stolen his time from his son, or if he had simply not known how to give love. For the first time in his life, Richard did not try to defend himself. He stood in front of cameras, his voice breaking, tears rolling down his face. He admitted openly that Maria had given his son something he never could, not days on a calendar, but days that felt eternal. He declared she had offered Ethan 7 days of true life, something beyond any measure of time. Richard's words moved the entire country. He explained that he had always trusted science, technology, and money to solve problems, believing they were enough to protect his family. But in his son's final moments, none of that mattered. He confessed his greatest mistake had been ignoring the simple but powerful truth that love was stronger than wealth or knowledge. Looking directly into the cameras, he apologized not only to his son, who was no longer there to hear it, but also to the public, admitting his failure as a father. He asked forgiveness for being distant and blind to what truly mattered. His honesty shocked many who were used to seeing him as a cold and powerful figure. People expected excuses or explanations, but instead, he gave vulnerability. This act of humility touched even his harshest critics. Richard admitted that Maria had been the true guardian of Ethan's final days, and that her love had given his son a legacy far greater than fortune or fame. For Richard, speaking these truths publicly was painful, but also liberating. It was his way of honoring Ethan and the woman who had shown him the real meaning of humanity. Meanwhile, Maria's life changed in ways she had never imagined. The media called her a heroine, praising her devotion and the impact she had on Ethan's last days. Crowds gathered outside the mansion, some holding signs with her name, others leaving flowers and letters of gratitude. Organizations and schools invited her to speak about her experience, wanting her to inspire others. But Maria remained humble. When reporters asked if she saw herself as a hero, she shook her head and said she had only followed her heart. She explained that anyone, rich or poor, powerful or not, could choose to show love. She insisted that she had not done anything extraordinary, only what was right for a child who needed her. This humility made people admire her even more. Maria avoided the spotlight whenever she could, always reminding others that the story was about Ethan, not about her. She repeated again and again that the boy's courage was the true miracle, and that she had simply stood by his side. Her words carried sincerity, and they reminded people that greatness often comes from the simplest of actions. The story continued to spread around the country, inspiring families, teachers, doctors, and even leaders. Ethan's legacy became a topic in schools, where children learned about how love and compassion can change lives. In hospitals, doctors told patients about his example, saying that hope and kindness were as important as medicine. Communities organized events in his honor, raising money for sick children and their families, often quoting Maria's words that love is measured not by time, but by intensity. News outlets kept revisiting the story, showing clips of Ethan smiling in the garden, holding Maria's hand, or laughing with his father. Each replay reminded people that his short life had left behind a powerful lesson. Richard himself funded programs in Ethan's name, supporting care for children with terminal illnesses, but he always gave credit to Maria for showing him what truly mattered. The trial of compassion, as the press called it, had turned into a nationwide reflection on values, forcing people to question what they prioritized in their own lives. For Richard, the transformation was personal and permanent. He stopped spending long hours in boardrooms and instead dedicated his time to causes that mattered. He visited schools, orphanages, and hospitals, speaking about his son and about what Maria had taught him. He admitted that he had once been blind to the power of human connection, but Ethan's last week had opened his eyes. His speeches were not polished business presentations, but emotional confessions that touched audiences. He explained that the real measure of a life is not how long it lasts, but how deeply it touches others. Whenever asked about Maria, he never failed to call her the true hero of the story. His vulnerability and his willingness to change softened his public image, but for him, it was not about reputation. It was about honoring his son's memory and keeping Ethan's legacy alive. Richard, once defined by money, was now defined by the lessons of compassion, humility, and love. He knew nothing would erase his regrets, but he also knew he could build a future inspired by what Ethan and Maria had shown him. Ethan's legacy, however, belonged not just to Richard or Maria, but to everyone who had been touched by the story. People remembered the boy who faced death without fear, and the woman who gave him strength through kindness. Maria's words that love is not measured by time, but by intensity, became a phrase repeated across the nation. Families used it to remind themselves of the value of everyday moments, no matter how small. Teachers wrote it on classroom boards. Hospitals placed it on walls to encourage patients and families. Ethan's short life became a symbol of courage, joy, and humanity, something that transcended the tragedy of his early death. Maria continued her work quietly, never seeking recognition, but her influence was undeniable. Richard lived with the weight of his past mistakes, but also with the gift of a new understanding. Together, their story left behind a legacy stronger than any empire, proving to the world that compassion is the greatest force a human being can offer. Ethan's final days were not an end, but a reminder of what it means to live fully and love deeply. 1 year after Ethan's passing, Richard had completely changed his life. The man who once spent his days in meetings and business negotiations decided to use his entire fortune for something greater. He created a foundation dedicated to supporting terminally ill children, giving them and their families the care and comfort that Ethan had received in his last days. The foundation was named after his son, simply called the Ethan Foundation. Richard announced the project in a press conference filled with journalists, doctors, and families who had already been touched by the idea. His voice trembled as he explained that his wealth no longer belonged to him alone, but would now serve to bring hope and dignity to children who needed it most. The foundation offered medical support, psychological care, and most importantly, moments of joy, just as Ethan had experienced in his final week. The mansion's garden, once a place of sorrow and farewell, was transformed into the headquarters of the project, filled with bright colors, toys, and areas where children could laugh and play. For Richard, this was not just an act of charity. It was his way of keeping Ethan alive, ensuring that his son's name would forever be linked to compassion, love, and courage. Maria was one of the first people Richard asked to join the foundation in a leadership role. He wanted her to manage the project and guide its direction, because he knew she carried the wisdom and heart that had changed Ethan's life. But Maria, in her humble way, politely refused a position of authority. She explained that her place was not in offices or boardrooms, but with the families and children themselves. She wanted to be close to them, to hold their hands, to sing songs, to tell stories, and to offer the same warmth she had given Ethan. Richard respected her decision, admiring her even more for her sincerity. Instead of titles and recognition, Maria chose to dedicate her time to visiting the hospitals and homes where the foundation worked. Parents often said her presence brought them peace in moments of despair. Children welcomed her like a friend, and many called her Aunt Maria. Just as she had been for Ethan, she became a figure of comfort for countless boys and girls. Her choice reminded everyone that true greatness is not measured by positions, but by the love someone gives. The story of Ethan and Maria continued to echo everywhere. Newspapers still wrote articles about the boy who had lived his last 7 days with courage, and about the maid who had turned those days into a gift for the world. Authors wrote books inspired by their journey, describing how compassion could transform pain into hope. Universities and schools invited Richard and Maria to share their experiences, and conferences on health and psychology used their story as an example of how emotional care was as important as medical treatment. Richard himself gave interviews on television, always repeating one phrase that had become famous: "Some storms destroy, others teach us how to love." For him, losing Ethan had been the greatest storm of his life, but it had also forced him to rediscover what love meant. Whenever he spoke those words, audiences were moved to silence, many with tears in their eyes. Maria, on the other hand, avoided the spotlight as much as possible, preferring to stay in the background. Still, her actions spoke louder than any speech. She was always seen kneeling beside a hospital bed, holding a child's hand, whispering encouragement, just as she had once done with Ethan. The Ethan Foundation grew rapidly, not because of its wealth, but because of the sincerity behind its mission. Families trusted it, children loved it, and volunteers joined with enthusiasm, saying they wanted to be part of Ethan's legacy. The programs offered everything from medical equipment to simple, joy-filled events like small parties, puppet shows, and outdoor activities. Each event carried the same spirit that Maria had created in the mansion's garden, a celebration of life, no matter how short it might be. Richard attended many of these events, often standing quietly at the back, watching children smile. He admitted to reporters that in those moments, he felt Ethan's presence more than ever. He said his son's spirit lived in each laugh, each hug, and each moment of courage shown by the children. For Richard, this was proof that Ethan had never truly left. His memory had turned into action, touching lives far beyond the mansion where it all began. The legacy of one small boy had become a movement of compassion that spread through the country, reminding everyone that hope can rise even from tragedy. Richard himself had changed completely in the eyes of the public. No longer seen only as a ruthless businessman, he was now recognized as a father who had learned from his mistakes. In interviews, he often spoke openly about his regrets, admitting he had once believed money could solve everything. He explained how Maria had taught him a lesson more valuable than any fortune, that love is what gives life meaning. He repeated again and again that Ethan had never truly died, because his courage continued to inspire. Richard's vulnerability surprised many, but it also made people respect him in a new way. He had turned his pain into a mission that helped thousands. Whenever he was asked if he had forgiven himself, Richard always answered that he had not, but that he was trying to honor his son every day. His honesty struck people deeply, and his story encouraged others to rethink their priorities. Across the country, families who had once ignored emotional connection began to cherish it, inspired by Richard's transformation and Maria's humility. The message of the foundation spread far beyond borders, reaching international communities that praised the work as an example of true humanity. Maria remained at the heart of it all. Though Richard's words carried weight in interviews, and though the foundation had grown into a respected institution, it was Maria who kept the essence alive. She continued to visit children, bring laughter, and remind families that love was stronger than fear. For her, nothing had changed since the days she held Ethan's hand. She simply extended that same care to many others. People began to call her the guardian of Ethan's legacy, but she never claimed any title. She always said she was only following her heart. For Richard, watching her was like seeing Stormborn in the stories Ethan loved, the one who chose to stay with the herd instead of leaving. Maria had chosen to remain close to the children, guiding them with tenderness and strength. Together, Richard and Maria carried Ethan's memory forward, each in their own way. The boy's short life had grown into a legacy that touched millions, proving that love is not measured by the length of time, but by the intensity with which it is lived. And in that truth, Ethan's presence continued forever. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.